Fasten your seatbelt and get ready for the red eye.
Each week, we'll be immersing you in a world of adventure, from thrilling dramas to side-splitting humour and life-altering moments. Welcome aboard the Red Eye. Somewhere in the sky, in the middle of the day, on a flight to JFK, a middle-aged lady was spotted running down the aisle naked from the waist down. No one knows how she had come to be this way. Perhaps she had simply forgotten to redress herself after going to the toilet. At the point at which the crew were alerted to what was happening, the situation soon became almost comical. A line of crew chasing her around the cabin, wielding a blanket with which they hoped to restore her dignity. The chase went on for some time, as she led her pursuers up one aisle and then down the next, and all the while she seemed to be enjoying the game she had created. When she did eventually stop, before they had a chance to cover her up, she threw herself down across an empty row of seats, opened her legs wide in the air, and asked the unassuming man opposite her to fertilise her. This lady needed saving from herself, and the shocked passengers had certainly seen enough. But despite their best efforts to make her comply, the crew failed to persuade her to get dressed and behave appropriately. In the end, the only choice they had was to restrain her in her seat so that they could get on with the rest of their work without having to worry about what she would do next. So, now that I have your attention, let me introduce you to the concept of passenger restraint. The act of physically restraining a passenger, literally handcuffing them and strapping them to a seat with colour-coded belts. That is, if we can get them to a seat. Stories have been told of particularly violent offenders being so hard to control that the crew have had no choice but to leave them on the floor once they've been secured. As crew, we do everything we can to avoid getting to this stage. Restraint is never something we want to do. So, we stop people drinking before they get drunk. When they are angry, we try our best to calm them. When they are fighting amongst themselves, we try to diffuse the situation and separate them if we can. But sometimes, no matter what we do to avoid it, some passengers just leave us with no other option. Because if they are so far past reasoning with that they could endanger other passengers or indeed the safety of the aircraft, it's not like we can just throw them out, is it? Even if we wanted to. And so, each year in training, we refresh our knowledge of how to do it, how to use the handcuffs, how to apply pressure to the right places to make them comply without causing harm, how to strap them safely to their seats so they can't get out. If we're honest, most of us wonder how it will all work out if the assailant is 250 pounds of pure muscle, but we push that thought to the back of our minds and hope that we never find out. It's never an easy call to make, but if you cross that line, then make it we must, no matter who you are. Midday, shortly after the first meal service, London Heathrow to Los Angeles. Amy took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "Yes, madam, how can I help?" she asked, balancing her tray on one hand and resetting the blue call bell above the seat with her finger. It had been too much to hope for. She'd been naive to think she could get all the way from the front of the plane to the back without getting stopped. She had put her virtual blinkers on and kept her head down, but some people were never going to let you get past them. And this one had put her arm out so far into the aisle, she literally could not get past. The lady looked up and smiled widely. She looked vaguely familiar to Amy, but she didn't know why. "Can I get a double vodka on the rocks, please?" she asked politely. "Certainly," said Amy, with a fake smile, shooting a look down at her arm in the aisle. She moved it. It had done its job. "Thanks so much," she said as she walked away. Amy put the tray down on the long bar that stretched between the two doors behind the business class cabin and pulled the grey goose from the shelf, just as the business class purser, Vass, appeared. "Any chance you could give this to 7H for me?" she asked. "I'm trying to get this cheese down to the crew at the back." She looked at the linen-covered tray, the reward for her colleagues in economy for surviving a brutal meal service with one less crew member than they should have had. "Ah," the purser picked up the glass and eyed the generous measure. "That will be her 5th double vodka," he said, "and last for a while. He pursed his lips as he poured half of it back into the bottle. "We've been trying to slow her down." "Oh, geez, I'm so sorry," Amy apologised. In all fairness, she had tried to ignore her. "It's okay, I forgot to tell you," he smiled. Amy had been working in the galley, so hadn't made it out into the cabin much until now. "Can you let the crew down the back know to look out for her, though? I wouldn't put it past her to go down there on the sly once I tell her she can't have any more." Amy laughed. "Roger that," she said, tipping her head and picking her tray back up. She'd never understood why anyone needed to get drunk on a plane, but in her 2 short years at the airline, she had witnessed it on so many occasions that it didn't surprise her anymore. "I'm sorry, madam, but I'm afraid I can't serve you any more alcohol for a while." Amy was using her most non-judgmental voice, trying not to upset the lady while kicking herself for answering the call bell when the others had just ignored it. She was quite certain that Vass had already told her she couldn't have any more, but here she was, blatantly asking anyway. "It's just that we have to monitor the amount." "Excuse me?" The lady's eyebrows raised almost to the top of her forehead as she drew in a deep breath, making herself taller in her seat. She brushed her long fringe either side of her face with her fingers. Amy had been about to explain that it was in no way a judgment of her behaviour, but they just weren't allowed to let passengers get drunk, and that the purser had asked them all not to serve her any more for a while. But she didn't let her finish, and from the way her eyes were burning molten holes right into her face right now, it was glaringly obvious that in her best efforts not to cause offence, Amy had failed in a big way. "Who the hell do you think you are?" she asked through gritted teeth, pointing her finger and circling it at Amy, before she seemed to suddenly lose all self-control. "Don't you know who I am?" she roared. Amy held her breath for a moment. She felt her pulse quicken, and she could sense the passengers around watching her, waiting to judge her on what she said next. In all of her 23 years, she had always hated confrontation. She'd run away from it in the playground, done anything to avoid it at home, and the last place she wanted to deal with it was on board. She blinked hard and said the only thing that she could think of. "I'm so sorry," she squeaked, and then turned and hot-footed it back into the safety of the front galley. The manager, Pippa, and Vass were stood side by side waiting for her, having obviously heard the shout. "What was that?" Pippa asked, frowning. Amy went to explain, but then she saw both of their faces drop as they looked up at something behind her. Amy didn't need to turn around. The way the hairs were standing up on the back of her neck right now were telling her that confrontation had just followed her, and, whether she liked it or not, there was nowhere to run. "I demand to speak to a manager!" The hot air of her breath on Amy's neck was followed by a sharp poke in her shoulder. Amy felt her legs go to jelly. "Do not touch my crew," Pippa scolded, taking a step forward. She reached out and put her arm on Amy's shoulder, guiding her protectively behind her and Vass. "I will take my seat when you get me my drink." The lady tipped her chin up in defence and put her fists on her hips. She was tall and lean and cut an imposing figure as she leaned over her. "Don't you know who I am?" she demanded, again. "No, madam, I don't," Pippa said slowly with a shake of her head, her hands on her hips now too. She stood her ground, even when she took another step towards her. "But I do know that you have had too much to drink." With that, chaos ensued. She launched forward, pushing Pippa backwards against the aircraft door and sending Amy flying into the aisle. Pippa righted herself, and then Amy watched in horror as the lady slapped her full force across the face. Pippa opened her mouth in shock and threw her hands up to protect her face from further attack. "Don't you know who I fucking am?" she screamed, spit coming out of her mouth as she shoved her once more. "How dare you! I earn more in a week than you earn in a fucking year!" With that, Vass threw himself forward, grabbing her with both of his hands. He pulled her off Pippa, wrapping his arms around her as she struggled violently against him. "Madam, calm down," he ordered. "Let fucking go of me!" She squealed, shaking her head left and right.
Don't you know who I am?
I'll get permission from the captain to use the restraint kit, Pippa said breathlessly, doing up her shirt which had come undone in the scuffle as she wrenched the phone from the holder. You, she nodded at Amy, get the kit from R2 and bring it here. Amy nodded and sprinted as fast as she could to the next door. And some more crew, quickly! She heard Pippa shout after her above the screams of the passenger. Amy's hands shook as she pulled the restraint kit out of the stowage and ripped it open. She took out the handcuffs and belts and was just about to take them to the front when the lady burst out of the galley and started running down the aisle towards her, closely followed by Vas. As he tried to grab her, she leapt over the middle seats, oblivious to the passengers who were still finishing off their dinner, sending plates and glasses flying. Like a gazelle, she bounded back and forth across seats, always just out of his reach, until she came flying around the corner of the bar to where Amy was now stood with 3 other crew.
Stop her!
Yelled Vas from behind.
Restrain her!
Yelled Pippa, who had just arrived. It wasn't the command they had practiced in training, and they hadn't had the briefing that they should have had beforehand, but sometimes things just don't go to plan. And so now, here stood Amy, holding all of the equipment, and suddenly, she found a bravery she didn't know that she had. Thinking quickly, she tossed the handcuffs to Valerie. You and me on arms, she said to Vas, who gave her a sharp nod of understanding. In the next second, as the lady tried to push past, they grabbed an arm each, flexed up her elbows, and pushed down on the back of her hands, fixing her from both sides with their hips.
Ah!
She yelled now, trying to wriggle free from their grip. But with each jerk, they pushed her wrist further until, all of a sudden, she stopped. Cuffs! Called Amy. Valerie slipped in behind them now, and Amy moved her wrist down in front of her. Click, click. They were on. Now, madam, Amy said, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. How about taking your seat?
Don't you know who I am?
Came the same reply as earlier, only it was much quieter now, almost childlike. Winnipeg, Amy curled her lip. Yep, Vas gave her a nod. It's cold there, right? Amy asked. Yep, he rolled his eyes. Amy knew they were both thinking the same thing, that they were diverting to somewhere not a single member of crew had suitable clothing for. Winter in California was very, very different to winter in Winnipeg. But she's just drunk. Do we really need to divert? I'm sure she'll wake up soon. Amy and Vas looked out of the galley and down to where the lady was slumped in her seat. Her hands were cuffed, one on top of the other in front of her, and a long belt was positioned in the crook of her elbows and around the seat back. It had been a surprise to them all when she had suddenly gone quiet and passed out. But Amy couldn't help thinking it wasn't quite the medical emergency the ground had deemed it, thus ordering the diversion, and more of a case of her having exhausted herself and falling asleep. But diverting they were, and until they landed, they were all to take a turn at babysitting her. Vas shrugged. Let's just hope they get her off quickly and we can just carry on. What a day, sighed Amy. She looked at her watch and groaned. Oh, my turn. What on earth am I going to say to her if she wakes up? She'll still be drunk, Vas grinned. You could tell her anything, he said, whispering something in her ear that made her giggle all the way down to her seat. Sitting down in the seat next to her, Amy studied her for a moment. Her strawberry blonde hair fell over her face, but she could see that she was someone who took care of herself. Her fingernails were manicured, her tanned skin was moisturized. The clothes she wore looked expensive, and the perfume she could smell no doubt cost a fortune. And yet, despite her money, something had gone very, very wrong for her today. Amy sat back and ran over what had happened. She would have to fill in a witness statement soon and be sure to get her facts right. Had she followed procedures well enough? Had she locked the handcuffs so they didn't get too tight? That was the problem. There were so many procedures in the huge manual, from medicals to hijacking, that you couldn't possibly remember them all word for word. And there just hadn't been time to read up on anything today. Oh. The voice snapped her back to reality, and she turned to see the lady was sat upright now with the most confused expression on her face. What? She stuttered, jerking forward against the strap. She threw her head around and looked at Amy through the fringe that was covering her face. Amy leaned backwards away from her. What's going on? She asked. Why am I tied to my seat? For a moment, Amy felt sorry for her. It was obvious that she had no recollection of what had happened. Opening her mouth to speak, the words Vas had whispered just came out. Oh, well, you see, we've been hijacked, madam, she began, stifling a laugh. Nothing to worry about. It's just that we aren't sure who the hijackers' accomplices are, so we've just tied everyone to their seats. As she tried hard to keep a straight face, she hoped that Vas was right about her not remembering anything later. Oh, she said, squishing her eyebrows together and seeming to think about it for a moment. Well, could I possibly get a double vodka? She asked. I'm afraid we can't serve alcohol in a hijack situation, madam, said Amy. Oh, she sighed and closed her eyes again. She woke as the wheels touched down in Winnipeg. Are we here? She asked Amy, who was still sat next to her. Yes, madam, she answered, unstrapping her own belt and getting up. She felt a blast of cold air as the door just opposite them opened and watched as 2 armed police officers and a paramedic stepped on board. They stopped to speak to Pippa for a moment before walking towards her. She moved back and used her hand to signal to them where the lady was seated. As she retrieved her designer luggage from the overhead stowage for her, she watched out from the corner of her eye as the paramedic quickly did some checks, and then as the police officer knelt down and explained to her the trouble that she was in. Amy couldn't hear exactly what he was saying, but she could hear the lady as she was lifted up from her seat. But don't you know who I am? She cried. She could be heard repeating it all the way to the door and along the cold jetway. Don't you know who I am? Don't you know who I am? Pippa pulled the doors closed and shivered. Right, let's get to the sunshine, she said. Who was she anyway? Amy asked. Absolutely no idea, laughed Pippa. While sat in check-in, a newspaper lay on the table and caught Amy's attention. A photo of one of her airline's planes and the headline. She had heard that it had gone to court, but only Pippa and Vas had needed to attend, and so she'd forgotten all about it until now. She opened up the news article. Actress given conditional release on charges arising out of air rage incident in 2002 when she hit and swore at a flight attendant. She was then handcuffed as the flight was diverted to Winnipeg, where she spent a night in detention. The defendant's lawyer says that she had been so traumatized by the September 11th attacks that she had developed a fear of flying and had consumed alcohol and tranquilizers before boarding. She was ordered to abstain from alcohol and non-medical drugs for a month and to reimburse the airline for the trouble she caused. Amy was wide-eyed as she read the list of movies she had appeared in, and even more so when she saw the name of her uber-famous ex-husband. Now she finally knew who she was. As with all our stories, they are based on true-life events, but some of the details may not be exact. So, to protect the donator of this story, and indeed the other people involved in this incident, unfortunately we can't share the actress's name in this podcast. Although, something tells me she might like you to know who she is. And you can always Google it. The Red Eye Podcast is produced and narrated by me, Ali Murphy. These stories are based on true events, but certain details, characters, and timelines have been altered to protect the innocent. Visit our website, theredeyepod.com, to subscribe to our newsletter and to find out details on how you can contribute your story for us to turn into an episode. If If you enjoyed listening to our stories, please like, subscribe, and review. Thank you.